All right, open tomb. And in Matthew, they witness, as they're walking up, they witness the stone rolling away and the angel descending, rolling the stone away with an earthquake and sitting on top of it. Now, Matthew is the only one that mentions the earthquake. Matthew is also the one who mentioned an earthquake at Jesus' death. So that kind of tells you something. Matthew's claiming there are two different earthquakes, one at the moment of his death, and then one at this, which rolled the stone away. We have no other attestations to that. We have...
Danielic Literature. Jim is currently in the final stages of his PhD, just finishing his dissertation, which explores a possible explanation for the composition of the Book of Daniel and the methodology and purpose behind the final redactors and compilers selection of the texts. During his early grad school days, Jim was a Pentecostal pastor with aspirations to build his own ministry. After only a few years in his PhD program, he slowly came to the realization that he had lost his faith and left the ministry as an atheist. Prior to pursuing his PhD, Jim received his master's in divinity in New Testament studies, which he had applied to his track to becoming lead pastor of the church he co-pastored. And recently, Jim has been involved in the atheist community as an organization leader, a public speaker, a debater, and also a content creator. Jim's primary focus, besides his studies, lie in his efforts to educate those on both sides of the fence where he can, applying his studies where it's needed most. He maintains the kind, nurturing nature he had as a Christian and hopes to build gates where there have long been only fences. Jim will speak for around 45 minutes, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Jim Majors. Jim, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I appreciate it. I'm very honored to be here and honored to be invited to speak. Before I get started, I just want to make one small amendment to the introduction. I have a Master of Theology instead of a divinity. Yeah, so we're here to talk about whether or not the empty tomb has body. Little play on words, whether the body of Jesus was actually there or whether the argument has any body to begin with. I'll start off by talking about something that happened back in the early 19th century. We have some eyewitness accounts from three men named Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery from 1829 that testify that in 1823, 6 years earlier, an angel descended from heaven and laid out the golden plates for Joseph Smith. Yes, I'm talking about Mormonism. The golden plates, once translated, became the doctrinal text of the Mormons known as the Book of Mormon. They all testified to this even less than a year after it occurred, and we have the signed statement to prove it, along with witnesses to the statement being taken and multiple letters of reference by esteemed members of the community who attest to the reliability and the integrity of these three men. And we're not talking about just anybody, but we have letters of reference by generals, judges, mayors, business owners, physicians, bankers, and law enforcement officials. If that's not enough to convince you, then there are 8 additional witnesses who testified to not only seeing the golden plates, but they eliminate all doubts by also testifying to holding the golden plates in their very own hands. Now, these 8 witnesses, like the previous 3, oh, well, I guess I should be showing my slides, huh? Let's see. Okay, so right here. Well, this is it's the list, and there's the original right there. Okay, so these 8 testified holding the golden plates, and less than 7 years after the event, we have 11 autographed firsthand eyewitnesses who account for the golden plates. And for those who don't know the story, it's a story that the angel Moroni came and told Joseph Smith that they were buried somewhere, and for years met him at the same spot to teach him enough to be able to translate these golden plates, and then eventually dug these plates up, which is when the first three men attest to it, and the 8 witnesses actually touch it themselves while it was being in the process of translation. Now, all 11 of these eyewitnesses proclaimed their belief until the day they died. They even suffered oppression and persecution, were even murdered for their beliefs by naysayers, even though by the end, none of them were in the church or alive. 6 of the 11 were actually excommunicated by the church, and they never, ever denounced their belief. There's not a single contemporary account that exists from that time that can be found that claims the golden plates and their divine origin is a lie. Now, that might sound convincing to you, but why? Why is that convincing? Why is that not convincing to you? Well, presuppositions. When we analyze and critically examine anything, our interpretations are confined to our existing presuppositions, whether we be Christian, Jewish, Mormon, Muslim, atheist, agnostic, or indifferent. Now, my whole life, I found the narratives of the life of Jesus to be incredibly inspiring, sometimes melancholic and other times infuriating, but always questionable. Now, my personal conviction for the better part of 30 years was that Jesus did die and rose from the dead, and that there was a tomb. And I felt no need to go and check the tomb. I felt no need to question who these writers were. I felt no need to question my authorities figures that were in my church who taught me many of these things. My Sunday school teacher, I didn't question it because the majority of the population that I grew up in, my entire life is centered around Christianity. Our personal conviction sometimes takes priority in the discovery of the truth, no matter what knowledge you're pursuing. But when it comes to the reliability of the Gospels, it suddenly becomes more of a priority, because we're not talking just about whether something's true or not. We're talking about whether this truth is an eternal life after we die, that is either to eternal salvation or to eternal torment. Now, all of the Gospels and all of the alleged eyewitness accounts of the birth, death, life, and the alleged resurrection of Jesus, the Son of God, are few. And I'd like to approach them with you today. And while I admit that I cannot approach this important question from an unbiased perspective without my own presuppositions, I can only analyze and accept verifiable and verifying information and offer up what knowledge I have to be analyzed and considered by you. So I invite you tonight to do that. The arguments that I'll be making are not epiphanic. They're not original. There are many before me and many after me who have and will come to the same conclusion that I have. And that is, the Gospels are not a reliable source of historicity. And throughout the history of Christianity, we see the effects of biased presuppositions in the way the Gospels are written, interpreted, copied, and preached. Christians love the empty tomb. Why? It's one of the few things that remain consistent in all 4 Gospels. And let me get a picture of that up for you. I'm not good at this whole Zoom thing, guys. Okay. So, well, it has a verse on it, but that's okay. You get the idea. That's the empty tomb. Now, Christians claim that the empty tomb is crucial to Christianity. The very doctrine itself claims that it's crucial to Christianity, and it's crucial to their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. But it's just an empty tomb. How is that evidence that Jesus, the Son of God, was sent to be crucified for our sins, rose from the dead, after 3 days appeared to over 513 people, if we take Paul's word for it, then ascended into heaven, where he will wait until it's time for him to return 2,000 plus years later? It's just an empty tomb. You know what that's evidence of? An empty tomb. What if I told you that my empty wallet, okay, lost my wallet, all right? What if I told you that it is evidence that I had $1 billion in cash in my wallet, along with a spare key to my yacht and a strip of photos from a date I went on with Bigfoot to the arcade. How many of you would believe that? You're likely not to be convinced about my empty wallet being evidence of anything but an empty wallet. You'd likely be even less convinced if I asked you, or if you asked me to show you my wallet and I didn't know where it was. Now, what if I showed you a bunch of wallets that couldn't be verified to be mine, and I expected to convince you? Even less, what if you learned that after questioning my friends and family, none of them knew that I had a wallet? Everybody, or $1 billion, or a key to a yacht, or Bigfoot, they likely wouldn't believe you either. And when it comes to the empty tomb, like my wallet, all we have is later claims without a physical tomb. And all we have to consider are the texts themselves, along with a few contemporary external references. So what else do we have to analyze these texts besides each other? We don't have any first century accounts that are authentic, or that scholars are confident are authentic. We have a couple that are claimed to be authentic but are not, most likely. So everything is biblical that we have until the 2nd century. And in the 2nd century, we start seeing arguments from both sides. But when it comes to the empty tomb and the post-resurrection narratives, we have 5 sources, essentially. We have Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and 1 Corinthians. Now, these aren't 5 independent sources, and none of them are eyewitness sources. The earliest gospel, Mark, it was written around the year 70 CE, about 40 years after the death of Jesus, give or take, I'd say 5 years. Now, this is the equivalent of you today without any, with just relying on your memory and your writing everything that you can recall about the life of Bob Marley, who died 40 years ago in 1981. It'd be really, really hard for you to get that all right. You would have to depend on already written sources, or you would have to depend on oral tradition. And according to most scholars, and I believe so myself, the vast majority of what we have, they are reliant on 2 things, and that is oral tradition and the Hebrew Bible. So we have to analyze this, but I have to stress that Jesus is a 1st century Jew living in the Middle East. Okay, so we have to look at this from a Jewish perspective, from the religion and the culture at the time, and the Hebrew scriptures. We can tell, like I said, that's a really, really big influence for these guys. So I want to talk to you about some contradictions. What spotlighted my video for everyone? Well, I hope is my mic unmuted?
No. Everything.
Oh, okay. I just got a pop-up that said, press this to unmute your mic. I was like, I thought I did. Okay. So when did the women go to the tomb? This is a big problem, because this is when the tomb is supposedly found. Mark 16:2 says that it was very early, and Matthew says that it was, let me get down to my script. Sorry. Come on, where is it? Okay. Yeah, well, anyways, so John is the only one that talks about it being dark, and the other ones say that it was light out. Then we have some other differences as well. Was the stone rolled away from the tomb already, or was the stone shut? The Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John all say that the stone was already rolled away when they got there. Now, the Gospel of Matthew talks about this angel descending, an angel of the Lord. It descended from heaven. It rolled back the stone with an earthquake, and set on top of it. So in Mark 16:4, Luke 24:2, John 21. Wait, there we go. There we go. Open tomb. Okay, cool. Yeah, that works. All right, open tomb. And in Matthew, they witness, as they're walking up, they witness the stone rolling away and the angel descending, rolling the stone away with an earthquake and sitting on top of it. Now, Matthew is the only one that mentions the earthquake. Matthew is also the one who mentioned an earthquake at Jesus' death. So that kind of tells you something. Matthew's claiming there are two different earthquakes, one at the moment of his death, and then one at this, which rolled the stone away. We have no other attestations to that. We have no attestations to that by anybody extra biblical. Now we have later apologists who are attempting to try to find earthquakes there at this time and everything like that. But we don't have any of the other gospels talking about earthquakes. Matthew also mentions the rising of the saints from their grave. With the first earthquake, the graves were opened, and with the second earthquake, it forced the dead out of the ground to rise and walk around and enter Jerusalem. We don't have any historical accounts of that happening. See, what else is Matthew exclusive in? The guards. Matthew claims that there are guards posted there, that the morning after that the chief priest requested that there be a stone rolled or a seal placed around the stone on the door, and that guards be placed there, which is just silly to me, because that's something that would never happen historically. And you have a lot of problems with the crucifixion itself, because it's my belief that the apostles were scared, that they were initially in danger, because we don't have any eyewitness accounts of the request to remove Jesus by Josephus. We have no eyewitness accounts of that happening. We have no eyewitness accounts of the burial. According to the Gospels, at best, a couple of women saw the burial, and Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and we don't have a written account from any of them. We don't have any eyewitness accounts of the discovery of the empty tomb. None of the women who supposedly discovered it actually wrote anything. Paul wasn't there, and the gospel authors were not eyewitnesses. This is something that nearly every New Testament scholar will agree on. Every historian, whenever historians look at this genre that is usually called Greco-Roman biographies, or BOI, and you might think, oh, biography, that sounds like it's pretty historical. It sounds like it's something reliable, something that I can read and really get the gist of what's going on here, and how much of this is reliable. But it's not. First of all, modern day biographies aren't accurate enough for us to say everything in here is absolutely true and we can trust it. Okay, let's just start with that. So we cannot trust modern biographies for something to be infallible or to be inerrant. Now, Greco-Roman biographies have been admitted by people like Mike Licona, by many Christian New Testament scholars. The vast majority of the New Testament scholars, or historians, or people relevant to the field of Greco-Roman literature, will agree that they are mythologized, that there are things added to them, that there are parts of the story that are completely fabricated in order to express some sort of a theological or a literary something for a theological or a literary purpose. Like when Jesus died, I don't think that any of the apostles knew when Jesus died, because we have a difference between the Gospels on whether he died on the Passover or whether he died on the day after, the day before. Christians can't even tell you when Jesus died, and it's only because of the mention of the Passover and the Friday that we are able to come up with two possible dates: April 7th of 30 or April 3rd of 33. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, first of all, only seem to portray 1 year of Jesus's ministry because there's only one mention of the Passover. And John's gospel, it is a 3-year ministry because he mentions 3 different times of Jesus coming to Jerusalem. And so according to John, he would be crucified in 33, but according to the other 3, also known as the synoptic gospels, he would have died in 30. And so it was either on the 14th or the 15th of the month of Nisan, which is the Jewish month. And so the eve of Passover is what John says, or Passover itself is what Matthew, Mark, and Luke say. So if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are true, that it was done on the Passover, first of all, Josephus would not have touched Jesus. Nicodemus would not have touched Jesus. They most likely wouldn't have had a trial. Trials usually weren't done on holy days, and they were usually, and the vast majority of them were not done at night. That was, it was an exception for a trial to be done at night, as it claims in the Bible. The vast majority of the early church fathers place it on the 14th. So, in other words, John is the only one that would be right. John places it in the day before Passover because John wants to portray Jesus as the Paschal lamb or the Passover lamb, because he sees for some reason that this sin is supposed to be some sort of a salvation. People interpret it differently. What John actually intended, I don't know. But nobody would work on this holy day. Nobody would work on the day of preparation. The only possible day that you would have it there is not the day of preparation, not Passover, but maybe that next Sunday, or Sunday. That's really about it. Let's see what else. So there was no witness to the trial either. Their trials were not held in homes, even though it's alleged that the trial was done in a home in one of the Gospels, anyways. And it's hard to synchronize these. You can't synchronize them. You can't make one coherent narrative out of all of these. Now, these we can look at these and we can get some sort of a truth, like a kernel of truth. But we can also determine what is most likely not true, and we can't do that by taking a dogmatic approach and by or a literal approach and taking these things to be 100% infallible. You really go into error there. Now, if you want to theologically interpret these texts, then that is your right. As long as you're not hurting anybody else or telling anybody else that they have to believe this, then I think that's fine. But to try to assert this as being true, as this is a literal written account of a person's life, death, and resurrection, that is wrong, and it is completely in error. And anybody who is a historian, and the vast majority of New Testament scholars, Old Testament scholars, just biblical scholars in general, will tell you that the way that we interpret this in church is very different from the way that we interpret this as historical texts. For instance, why were the women going to the tomb with spices? Well, they were either going to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus, or they were going to visit the tomb. The ones who aren't Jewish know that that the body would have already been anointed before the burial. It was part of the funerary preparation. They would wrap the body in linens and alternating layers of aloe and everything after they had cleaned the body. Now we don't have any references to first century funerary practices, but we know what they likely did before, and we know what they likely did after. So there's really not a whole lot of change there. You know, they still would wash the body, alternating with hot and cold water or warm and cold water. They would apply these spices and these aloes, and they would wrap the body in linen. Usually, it was a 3-piece suit. Now they changed things later on, of course. But if we just look at the Gospels and we look at them one by one, we can't tell if the tomb was open, if the tomb was closed, what somebody saw. But the passage suggests that the women were going to the tomb after the Sabbath for the purpose of preparing the body with spices. Jesus was already buried. And if you want to try claims for purification, he didn't require purification. You couldn't purify a tomb. A tomb is just a tomb. It's a place of death. It was used to mask the smell of decomposition up to and through the funeral preparations and the funeral procession. And we know that Jesus was not buried in an honorable way because, first of all, he was crucified. The Romans would use crucifixion as a warning to others. It was something that usually was preceded by some scourging, beating, things like that, and then they would be placed on a cross, or placed on a stake or an X. There were several different methods of crucifixion. Some would be tied, some would be nailed, some would be impaled. The vast majority of the ones that we have historical accounts of were most likely impaled. We have Josephus, who is a member of the Sanhedrin, and we have Nicodemus, who is the highest priest in the Sanhedrin. So he's the top guy. Now, these two people are the ones who some gospels say that they voted unanimously to convict Jesus. Now, we know that that they didn't have the authority to execute Jesus because obviously he was crucified. Jews did not crucify people. That was not their dig. They like the old-fashioned rock and roll. And according to John, Nicodemus brings 75 pounds of these spices and aloes, right? 75 pounds was more than they would do for a king. It's more, I mean, they might do it for a king, but it'd be extravagant. But it was more than Gamaliel was given. He was the Jewish mentor of the Apostle Paul. So there's one problem. Why bring the spices to the tomb? Now, like I said, in history, we have a lot of these miraculous accounts that we have, these things that appear to be biographies that are highly mythologized. It's like if we look at the extra biblical sources for Jesus, or for Jesus' resurrection, or for the martyrdom of the apostles, the first historians that we look at are Tacitus, Josephus, and Suetonius. Two Roman historians, and Josephus is a Jewish historian. All of them were born after Jesus' death. Jesus died at the latest 33, which would be 4 years before the first historian was born, which was Josephus. Then Tacitus, about 30 years later, and Suetonius about 45 years later. But these are first century historians, and they all recorded this man who healed the lame and made the blind to see. No, not Jesus, Vespasian. And all three wrote about Jesus, except they weren't born until years after the crucifixion. Now, Vespasian, he didn't die until 79. So Tacitus and Suetonius would have both been established men in the community at that time, both being in their 20s and 30s, respectively. Josephus would at least have been able to be an eyewitness as a child. And the accounts from these three historians are far more miraculous than their accounts of Jesus. So we have multiple attestations. From Tacitus' Histories, 481, we see one of the common people of Alexandria, well known for his blindness, threw himself at the emperor's knees and implored him with groans to heal his infirmity. This he did by the advice of god Serapis, whom this nation, devoted as it is to many superstitions, worships more than any other divinity. He begged Vespasian that he would deign to moisten his cheek and eyeballs with his spittle. Another, with a diseased hand, at the counsel of the same god, prayed that the limb might feet the print of a Caesar's foot, or might feel the print of a Caesar's foot. And so Vespasian, supposing that all things were possible to his good fortune, and that nothing was any longer past his belief, with a joyful countenance, amid the intense expectation of the multitude of bystanders, accomplished what was required. The hand was instantly restored to its use, and the light of day again shone upon the blind. Now, this is the kicker. Tacitus says, persons actually present attest both facts, even now, when nothing is to be gained by falsehood. Now, what does that sound like to you? That sounds like some apologetics. Cassius Dio, famous Roman historian, that says that Josephus Vespasian, that was his name, Josephus Vespasian, the first emperor of the Flavian dynasty, healed two people, one having a withered hand, the other being blind, who had come to him because of a vision that he saw in a dream. And Cassius says he cured the one by stepping on his hand and the other by spitting upon his eyes. Now, there's a little bit of a difference there. Like, one just says moisten his cheeks and eyeball with his spittle, but this one says spitting upon his eyes. So, maybe there's a little bit of a difference, but so far, that sounds right. The Christians have what they call a minimal facts argument. It's gone from 12 to 4 or 5. There aren't very many that's left. And I have no problem with what few that they attest to, but that Jesus was crucified, that the disciples had what they believed to be appearances of Jesus. That's really about as far as I'm willing to push it. I know that the martyrdoms for the vast majority of them are greatly exaggerated. We don't have any first century ones for anybody that are consistent or that are even accurate. Maybe some just maybe hint at dying, but no cases where somebody was offered a opportunity to repent, or that they were arrested for their beliefs, or that they were executed for their beliefs. People like Gary Habermas will tell you that the empty tomb is not a minimal fact. He even says that it is obvious that it does not enjoy the near unanimity of scholarship. And he said that 8 years ago. And maybe about 40 years ago is whenever we started to really see these things, as the vast majority of scholarship started to accept that these were not eyewitness accounts. You had people before that, but for the most part, it was hard going, because I'm in a field with Christians. Just fair and simple. Well, Christians and Jewish people. It's hard going whenever you present something that threatens their dogma, that threatens their presuppositions. And and it's hard to be taken seriously with new arguments. For example, I argue for a late dating of the Book of Daniel, and it's hard going because there are so many people who still argue that it was written back during the Babylonian exile. So I would ask you today to take these ideas, and like I said, that they weren't epiphanic, they were not original, and that there have been many before me and many after me who have come to the same conclusion that I have and will come to the same conclusion that I have. And that's at minimum, if nothing changes, or if anything changes, it's going to be this. If nothing changes, it's going to be that the gospel is not reliable. You cannot approach it from an unbiased perspective, analyze it, and come away with the same conclusion. So I'd ask you to get rid of your presuppositions so much as you can. I know you can't get rid of them, but ignore them just for a second. Just set them aside and approach these texts from an unbiased approach. Verify them, analyze them, cross-reference them. Don't just look into what is canon. Look at other things that may not be canonical. You'll find things like Jesus was the size of a skyscraper and that there's a talking cross that came out of the tomb. You'll see so many of these stories about Jesus that you will see that early on there was no cohesive theory. If you're lucky, you might even find one where Jesus has a twin that went to Japan, and his twin was crucified, and Jesus actually went to Japan and died an old man. But yeah, just go home and check the empty wallet. And if you can't find an empty wallet, then there's a good chance that there wasn't anything to put in it. Thank you so much for considering me for tonight and for listening.
Thank you, Jim. That was incredibly informative and very, very well researched as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now we'll open up for Q&A. If people have questions, they can send in the chat or indicate that they have a question, and we can ask you to unmute. And we'll take questions from both the YouTube chat as well as the Zoom chat. Or yeah, you can raise your hand.
Cool.
Yeah,
please ask away.
Yeah. Rashida?
Yes.
You have a question?
Yes. So my question is, the foundation of my question. So your premise is based not on the narrative of the Bible, but on the reliability of the text. But what are your comments on narrative disproofs of this particular story in the gospel?
So like I would say that the contradictions in the narrative itself. When did the women arrive? Who did Jesus appear to first? Was the tomb open or was it closed? Was there one man sitting on the inside? Was there two angels that suddenly appeared to them after the women entered? Was there two men who didn't appear until a second visit by Mary, according to John? So I mean that the whole narrative from the time that Jesus, I would say from the time that Jesus dies until all the way up through his resurrection appearances, there are inconsistencies, which leads me to believe and to come to the conclusion that there were no eyewitnesses, that these authors had no idea what happened to Jesus, had no idea how he died or what was done with his body.
Yes. Well, part of my question, my follow-up question in that is, if doesn't the confusion and the chaos at the death and burial and resurrection of Christ, doesn't that chaos speak more in favor of the resurrection of Christ? Considering you said that they didn't know what happened, but that's part of the gospel stories, that there was chaos. They literally didn't know what happened.
So sometimes that is the case. We do expect small differences in eyewitness accounts, but there's a few problems. These aren't eyewitness accounts, and if they were eyewitness accounts, we would not see variations on this scale of this magnitude. For instance, if I were to call the police about a home invasion, and they came and they started asking us questions, they separated us like they should and asked us questions. They wouldn't let us copy each other's statements, for one. Over 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in Matthew, and over 50% is of the Gospel of Mark is in Luke. So that's one reason we call them the synoptics, is because they can be read side by side against each other, and we can see, in many cases, verbatim, a definite evidence of usage of the other. So, and of course, Mark, as I'm sure you know, is supposed to be the translator of Peter, a guy named John Mark. John Mark never knew Jesus, so he definitely couldn't have been the eyewitness. So you have Matthew and Luke, who, if they were eyewitnesses, are copying somebody who wasn't an eyewitness. And as I said in my presentation, we have no eyewitness accounts of the removal of Jesus from the cross, because none of the authors, even if they were eyewitnesses, would have seen it. No eyewitnesses to the burial, no eyewitnesses to the resurrection, no eyewitnesses to the discovery of the empty tomb, and no eyewitnesses of the ascension. And yeah, that's about it.
I guess a follow-up question is a eyewitness account is an eyewitness account the give the most weight? Meaning, if it's not an eyewitness account, does that mean that that there's no merit to the story that we're giving? For example, I'm Jamaican. You mentioned a story about Bob Marley, and based on there are going to be historical facts about Bob Marley. For example, the evidence of his life, for example, through his children. You know, how many children he has would indicate some of the wives that he had while he was on earth, for example. Right. And so that becomes inevitable evidence, right? So I don't know. And then I don't know if it's necessarily fair to say that because there's no eyewitness accounts, the eyewitness accounts of the persons who discovered Jesus' body were women, and their testimonies were not considered legal or legitimate in the times of the Bible. I also have questions about their, for example, I don't have any evidence of their literacy rate or their education levels. And oral traditions aren't necessarily they're not to be looked down upon. If we look at members if we look at Israelites, modern day people of Hebrew descent, there are a number of accounts that they can recollect from their own experiences, traditions that they do over and over every single year, that remain strong even thousands of years later. So I don't know if it's necessarily fair to discount the oral tradition. In my own culture, oral tradition is very much all that we have for some aspects of history. So I think that the recording of such oral tradition in such an early text is viable. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So I'm not saying that oral tradition that there's no truth to it. I believe that Jesus did exist. I believe that he existed as a man. I believe that he was crucified. But also, whenever you have multiple variations in an oral tradition, then either one is true or one isn't. I debated a gentleman, and he gave me a great example, trying to use it as a defense for the historicity of the empty tomb. And he said, "But what if I told you that there's a story about a boat that was supposed to be unsinkable, and it did sink, and they had to have life vests, and very few people survived, and all this other stuff." And I was like, "Oh, I'd say that's probably historical." And he said, "Well, wrong. This is a book called Titan, and it was written before the Titanic sank." And he said, so you see, so this isn't true, but so how do you know that the Titanic is true?" And I was like, that is brilliant. That's great. I don't know why he was using it as a defense for his position, because what that's saying is that either one is a historical narrative or none of them are, but both can't be because of the differences in them. And like this, of the I'll say four, because the fifth one being Paul doesn't really go into detail, doesn't even mention a tomb. So just with the Gospels, we have to look at that and say, okay, not all of these can be true. So either Mary didn't know where they put Jesus's body, or Mary was told by the angel that he had risen. It can't be both. Either the tomb was open when they got there, or it was closed. It can't be both. And then you have the additional problem of the location of the tomb. With Bob Marley, we can go and we can find all of these artifacts and all these places that he's been. You know, all these claims of his family. You know, we can verify that. But we don't have evidence of an empty tomb. We don't know where this tomb is. The earliest tomb being claimed by Christians wasn't until the 4th century. So, I mean, about 300 years after the death of Jesus.
We have a couple different questions. One of them is from YouTube. Someone on YouTube,
Hi, YouTube.
Brio Jaffa, is asking, why is it important or relevant to evaluate the veracity of miraculous events in a religious faith? How much of a person or group's faith is based on historical proof of events?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I'd go back to my example of the Book of Mormon, the golden plates. Quite a bit of their beliefs are based around these claims about this angel and these golden plates and this divine language that only Joseph can interpret. And yeah, I mean, it's centered around that. Without that, they'd just be Christians. You know, every single one of them were raised Christian, and which is why they had these similar but very different beliefs. It's very, very much like, but not that similar, but it's very much alike if you look at Christianity from Judaism. That at first there wasn't a very distinct difference, but now there's a very clear difference. But Christianity very much relied upon Judaism to build the foundations for their theology, and like them, the Mormons were very much dependent on Christianity to build their ideology.
Interesting. And we have a question from Toby Lanhaver.
Yeah, so I'd just like to press a bit harder on, like, why does it matter if the empty tomb is fake? Of, like, does that invalidate the golden rule or anything else that basically Jesus is like Hillel, but slightly more charismatic, I guess, because he's spreading further?
Well, no, I mean, absolutely not. You know, you don't need religion to tell you to treat other people the way that you would want to be treated. All that can be found elsewhere. The reason that this is important, it wouldn't be important if there weren't people who were using this to oppress and persecute others, if they weren't using this text to justify treating other people like crap and telling them what they can and can't do with their bodies, or what they should do with their children, or what they shouldn't do with the person they love. And that's why it's important to me to speak about this.
And we have a comment from YouTube saying, "I have no questions, but thank you for doing this, Jim."
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for watching.
I have a question, which is that earlier you mentioned that there is wide agreement among the New Testament scholars that none of the biblical authors were present for, was it the crucifixion? Or, yeah, and I was going to ask, what is the evidence for that?
Well, the evidence for that is internal. In the Gospels themselves, it says that the apostles were afraid and they ran and hid. In fact, when Jesus appears to them in Luke, they are hiding in the upper room with the door locked.
And we have a question from Vincent Lau, which is, do you have more details on evidence for why you do not believe in the empty tomb as a minimal fact?
Sure. Because it can't be verified. It's not just me. Even when it was considered an empty fact, a minimal fact way back in like 30, 40 years ago, even then it was considered the least likely to be a minimal fact. And now it's no longer considered a minimal fact. The minimal fact is something that is most likely to have happened. Out of all of the possible explanations that we have, it's something that is most likely to have happened. And in addition to, I guess, the reasons that I already said about why it most likely would not have been the empty tomb as an actual physical historical occurrence, is because of the Romans' crucifixion practices. They would leave the body up and leave it on display for others as a warning after it had been beaten. So we wouldn't have any eyewitness to things like Jesus being pierced with a lance. It says that Jesus's legs weren't broke, even though it says that Pilate ordered them to break their legs. That's not something that a Roman would do. Roman soldiers were often very harshly punished, especially the ones on crucifixion duty, if somebody removed the body, or if they didn't do what they were told, or break their legs, or if they allowed somebody to speak to them or something like that. They would. We even have evidence of them being crucified upside down for fudging a crucifixion. We have several historical accounts of them being carrion, being food for the buzzards and the dogs. Shows that they were given a very, very disrespectful burial. And in the times that they did dispose of the bodies, it was done in a trench grave, potter's field. They weren't given a tomb because a criminal's body is a cursed body. And for Romans by and large didn't care how Jews felt or what their feelings were about somebody who seems to have been killed for the claim of being the king of the Jews.
Thank you. Interesting. And Sam Humphreys has a question.
Hi, Jan. Thanks again for speaking tonight. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, I had to step out for a couple minutes. I apologize if you touched on this, but I was curious to get your, I guess, what you find to be kind of the most convincing counter argument or explanation for Paul's claim. And I believe that 1 Corinthians that there's about 500 witnesses who supposedly saw the risen Christ, or I guess a vision of the risen Christ after the resurrection.
Right. Okay. So 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 15:6, where they talk about the 500. And like most people read that and they're like, wow, 500 people, there's no way that they all hallucinated the same thing. But then you see that when you look at the people who actually take this to be an early creed, which there is a small part of it that is an early creed, but it doesn't include the self-reference by Paul. It doesn't include the 500. So, and it doesn't match the structure. The reason that most scholars believe that it's an early creedal statement is because it has this structure, this cadence to it. That's kind of like a 2-word. What would you call it? And I don't know. It just has little brief intervals. It's just do, and at one point it just loses all of that, and that's with the 500. I believe 1 Corinthians 15:3-5 is what most scholars agree is the original creedal statement. But to the 500, we don't have any names for them. We don't know if Paul met them. He doesn't claim to have met them. The Gospels don't mention them. And now Christians like to say that, oh, well, they could have just went and just verified, because Paul says that there were some that were still alive at this time. But that's also an addition. That's an addition that is sometimes even seen as an addition in addition to the 500. So as a separate one later, as if somebody already asked this question, they were like, oh, shoot, I got to fix this again. And so, but from Corinth to Jerusalem is a long trip. And if all they knew was that they were 500 people who, if the creedal statement originated in Jerusalem, they wouldn't know that they were from Jerusalem, because with it being there where the temple is, then they might not have been from Jerusalem. They could have been anywhere, especially if Jesus appeared to them around this time. So, and not only that, but we're talking about a long walk, a donkey ride, a couple donkey rides, a ship ride across the sea. I don't know, probably at least 2 Ubers. And that traveling was something that a rich person did. If you couldn't get there on foot, then it would take a lot for you to do something, to travel that far just to check on something that might or might not be true. It's the same thing with the empty tomb. People say, oh, well, they could have just said, well, I'm going to go and check for myself. Like, okay, what are you going to do? You're going to go there. You're going to try to find somebody if you have the money and the time and you don't get killed on the way there. And then you get shown an empty tomb. Okay. Well, is that it? Like,
and yeah, it sounds like Rashida has another question.
Sure.
Oh, am I unmuted? Okay, great. Yeah, so I have, I don't know if this is a question, but I'm just going to think out loud. So Jesus was considered a king by the disciples and the people who followed his ministry. And specifically that he was a king who was meant to bring a new kingdom into the world. And so the entire story, the finishing story of Jesus' death and his resurrection, none of the disciples expected that Jesus would have died in the first place. They thought that he was there to bring this new kingdom to earth, that was what he was going to do. And they thought that this king would appear in a different way. They thought that, they thought he would bring forth political reconciliation, as well as that, God's kingdom would be coming on earth for the Israelites to rule. And but instead, something completely different happened, and that kind of places a dent in that narrative. So the empty tomb, it places a dent in the original premise that the Israelites' expectations of the Old Testament and their interpretations of what this new kingdom would look like. Why should their king die? why is it that Jesus, the Bible talks about how Jesus had no form. He didn't really have a kingly form. And so how on earth is he going to bring a new kingdom on earth if he dies? And I want to bring this up because narratively, it doesn't actually make sense. And narratively it doesn't make sense. Given the direction of the Old Testament, it makes sense now in terms of the final direction of where the Gospels go and other accounts in the New Testament. But originally, if you're looking at this from the perspective of the disciples, Jesus shouldn't have died. Why die to resurrect? Why couldn't he just have stayed alive? And I mention this because the death and resurrection of Christ has a theological significance. It has there's a consistency in this account it's more so related to the overarching narrative of the Bible, which is man's reconciliation to God through Christ. And it wasn't necessarily perceived that is how things would even go. But again, interpretation of scriptures versus what actually happens in real life, like interpretation of prophecy specifically versus what actually happened in real life is just completely opposing. So I kind of, it's not really a question, but was hoping, could you press into that a little bit more in terms of like how do, I don't really know how to form my thoughts, but yeah, how does this lived out experience, this experience of the chaos I was mentioning earlier and the expectations of the disciples versus what actually happened, all of those are theologically relevant, but they aren't what was expected. I don't know if you can kind of discern a question out of that, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to. So the word for anointed one is Mashiach, and an anointed one was somebody who was either a king or a priest, and it's because whenever they were first put on the throne, they were blessed, and everything with anointing oil. Now Jesus was never anointed either king nor priest. Now the Jews were expecting more than one Messiah in the Jewish scripture. You get to remember, these texts are written at different times. So like the one in Isaiah is not the same as the one in Daniel, and like even in the Old Testament, it names Cyrus as a Messiah. So around this time where Jesus is, we have kings and we have high priests. Well, we know Jesus isn't a high priest. We already know who the high priest is, and we know he's not a king. We already know who the king is. And the Messiah was not expected to die. It's not that Jesus wasn't expected to die, but that the Messiah, that was prophesied, was not expected to die. They were expected to liberate the Jews and to unite the 12 tribes back in Israel and restore the temple. But Jesus did none of that. So Jesus definitely was not the expectation of the Jewish Messiah. And it's because he died. Had he not died, then the apostles would not have had to gone to the extremes that they have by reinterpreting Old Testament text in order to justify positing Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, or the Messiah that was expected at the time.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
No problem. Just a quick response, I guess. So I was thinking about what you were saying about Jesus wasn't anointed king nor priest, but I think that was part of the point. For example, those who were anointed priests, for example, the Pharisees, they ended up it became clear that that their interpretations of the law were corrupt. So they would, for example, use the law to, for example, divorce their wives. So they had
Rashida, I might cut you off real quickly and ask you to continue this thread of thought a little bit later.
Afterwards.
I think, yeah, it sounded like Alexa might have had a question.
Okay, no problem.
We have a casual hangout afterwards, like after the event is formally ended around 8:30ish or whenever. No more questions. So you're welcome to hang out and have back and forth informally. Yeah, did Alexa, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, my question was kind of a follow-up. So I think, I'm not sure if Rashida, you were going to touch on this, but yeah, I was just like, I think Jim, your answer made me think of just a particular passage in Daniel chapter 9. I know there's like one prophecy that talks about the anointed one being killed, and I know you mentioned the anointed one, so I was curious like how that fit into your explanation.
Daniel 9, verse 24 through 27. It talks about the one who is cut off. So this is part of Daniel, the last part, chapter 7 through 12, that was written in the 2nd century BCE. And it is written during the time where the Jews were under oppression by the Seleucid Empire, specifically Antiochus IV or Antiochus Epiphanes. And at around this time, the high priest, Onias III, was killed. And you have Antiochus IV, who is trying to implement all of these policies. He wants to outlaw circumcision. He makes the sacrifices illegal, and he further desecrates the temple by building a statue in it. There's some accounts of him sacrificing a pig on it. And one way or another, he basically invalidates the entire Jewish religion, and there are some Jews that go along with him. And this is what causes the Maccabean revolt, and a big war happened. But Daniel 9:24-27 was written ex eventu to give the Jewish people hope, because they had just came out of one persecution where they had said, like in Jeremiah, where he had said that in 70 years that he was going to deliver the people. And so Daniel 9 is, if you read Daniel 9, it's basically an angel arrives after Daniel prays and tells Daniel, "Oh, well, silly, you just misunderstood what Jeremiah was saying, and what it really is it's 77s, so it's 490 years." And okay, so extend all that, so it gives the Jews at this time hope, saying, "Oh, okay, well, that's just around the corner. Like we don't have long to wait for that." So that explains our current persecution. And also, Daniel is writing at a time where there are people who are willing to rise up against the Seleucids. You have Maccabeus and all these other priests who actually go to war, like they actually kill Seleucids. So Daniel's kind of written dual purpose, to give the people under oppression hope, and to create unity amongst Jews, especially at a time where there is so much division with different sects and whatnot.
On the subject of Daniel, could you talk a little bit more about your research? You've told me a bit about it, but I think it might be interesting for the audience to hear as well.
Right. So I mean, basically, my research is centered around the methodology behind the selection and later revisions of older 5th and 6th century BCE early court tales, like Daniel and his three friends in the furnace, lion's den, all these old stories about Daniel. So my research and my writing is basically on why they chose these texts, what they added to it, and why they compiled it. And basically, what it boils down to is they took these texts because they were already either in circulation, or they were popular. Maybe they possibly were being read in liturgical settings. So they took these because people found them authoritative, and they continued on as if they were the original narrator, or narrators, should I add. The Book of Daniel is written in essentially three different languages. It's got Greek, it's got Hebrew, and it has Aramaic. And so I go into a little bit on the dating of it, because that's important, because whenever you're making the claim that that the Book of Daniel was compiled from earlier sources by a later author, you're already implying that there was, not only two different dates of authorship, but two different authors. And so talk about how we can do certain, like I give certain linguistic arguments, such as for Aramaic, the earliest Aramaic that we have is from the imperial period. It doesn't date back to the Babylonian exile like Daniel posits to have been written. Going to the historical inaccuracies, such as, when Nebuchadnezzar did what, and whose son was, and where this guy went, and who won this, and all of that. And I go into some of the interpretations of Daniel 9's prophecy. Go into the identification of historical figures in Daniel chapter 8 and 11 and 12. Yeah, I think that's a brief summary. I guess about as brief as I can make it.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very interesting. Sohan, was there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I have a question actually.
Sure.
What's the earliest that we have non-gospel from the area of like Jerusalem, indicating that Christianity was becoming an issue? Like, was there anything, like anyone noting down, hey, there's some people talking about an empty tomb, or there's some people talking about a risen person, and especially like, is there anything within we're not exactly sure when exactly it happened, or whatever exactly was even alleged to happen, but like, within say the 40 days between the alleged resurrection, alleged ascension, or something like that, someone saying maybe, hey, there's some people claiming that that the guy we killed like a few days ago is giving speeches to 500 people at a time, or something like that, or even just like anything in general, just like, hey, people are forming a movement around some guy that we supposedly killed a while back. When's the earliest we have like non-gospel, just like, I don't know, a Roman or a Judean just like noting down some detail that's not like connected with the larger story or anything?
Right. So in the first century, we don't have anything. We might have a reference by Josephus. There was the Great Fire of Rome during the reign of Nero, who and it's being blamed on the Christians. That's it's late first century. So I mean, as far as causing problems, they're blamed for the fire. Whether or not they did it or not is I'm unsure of. But they started getting in trouble whenever they started being forced to do what everybody else was doing, which was adhering to the Roman temple practices. So going to the temple and giving libations to your god in the name of the emperor, for his good health and for his rule and everything. And anything that happened to the community was automatically blamed on somebody who didn't go to temple, or somebody who didn't give their offering. Or so if there was somebody in town who was known to, to be somebody who refused to give libations to Zeus, say, and say that somebody's kid got struck by lightning, they likely get pissed off at the person who didn't get their libation. So that became a problem. It became a problem when they wouldn't, when it became necessary to pledge yourself to give an oath of faith to the emperor, to devote yourself in exchange for Roman citizenship. So in order to become a Roman citizen, you had to first do this, and then you got a little piece of paper that said, I'm Roman and I can do stuff now. And you were allowed to do certain things. A lot of places would ask for your certificate of Romanness, I guess. Yeah. So, and you're also required to pay taxes to the government, to the emperor. The emperor was often deified. They were seen as a god. They weren't just an emperor. They were divine in some way. For example, like Romulus. Romulus is somebody who is said to have his body is said to have disappeared and ascended to heaven. Which we have a lot of those, of course. But and they're called the Son of God. They're called the Enlightened One. They're called the Divine Son. There's a lot of deification going on there. So it's nothing unusual.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Did I answer your question okay?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like right from the beginning, I think you came off with just kind of shot it down with, I guess there's nothing within the first century, right? Like in terms of no one actually noticed, no one non-Christian noticed Christians like for a long time after the alleged resurrection, basically.
Well, we don't even have Christians noticing Christians. Outside of the Bible, we don't even have any Christians talking about Jesus. Well, I mean, it's possible that maybe one of the early apocryphal gospels, maybe the Gospel of Peter, or maybe, but there's, I mean, Judaism is still by and large the biggest religion. Christianity didn't really explode until the reign of Constantine. But I mean, like if you were to look at the growth of Mormonism, say next to the growth of Christianity versus their Christianity and Judaism, then you would see a really similar increase. It's exponential, because in order for the early church fathers talk about, like the best ways to convert, and they found out pretty quick that they didn't do a whole lot of good going and talking to big crowds and trying to get all these crowds to to believe in them and to believe this, because a Jewish person would have been scared to be a part of a crowd and to just speak up and openly commit blasphemy. That wouldn't be a good look. But they found out it was much easier for them to convince one person, and they would convince their family. So once they started doing that, it went from being just a few places around the Mediterranean that were exposed to these beliefs, but then it spread all across the Roman Empire. And they were given special exceptions. They no longer had to worship in the temple. They no longer had to sacrifice to another god. Basically, the agreement that they made was, you guys can practice your belief, but you need to sacrifice to your god in the name of the emperor. So that was the quid pro quo. And then you see a really big increase whenever they outlawed paganism, when they started destroying pagan temples, when they started killing people, executing people for being pagan. then Christianity saw a huge increase. But Christianity as a religion was still very sectarian in its early ages. And it wasn't until 4 or 5 centuries later, hundreds of years later, I would even argue up to 1,000 years later, until you really start seeing some sort of solidarity amongst the Christian sects. It was a long way going, whether Jesus was God and whether there was a Holy Spirit and how long was Jesus and was Mary a virgin. The early church was much more like little home churches than it was like your Southern Baptist Convention, where you can have thousands of churches that believe the same thing.
Thanks.
You're very welcome.
I have a really quick question on the you mentioned that as the various like pagan sects and temples and things were getting like attacked and like the government was trying to stamp those out, those people fled towards Christianity. And I wonder, is that something that's kind of recurred throughout history, where like minority religions have attracted other minority religions that people are kind of fleeing from?
Are you asking if it's similar?
I'm asking, like, are there any other, like, is that something that recurs throughout history where when one minority religion is getting stamped out, the adherents tend to join other kind of minority religions or something like that?
Well, I wouldn't even say that they were the minority. What it was is that Theodosius, he basically did what Constantine did. Constantine was the first one in the 4th century to actually support Christianity. He even became Christian and was baptized himself. Granted, it was by an Arian bishop. But so Constantine, this was like in the 320s, 320s, 330s. So it's only 50 years later that Theodosius I starts persecuting pagans. So Constantine banned animal sacrifices, which basically did it in for anybody trying to bring back Judaism, or at least the Judaism that they were familiar with. But it also affected a lot of the pagans, because a lot of the pagans did animal sacrifices as well. Anybody who was found supporting pagans were punished. And in 389, he actually put out two decrees, a year apart from each other, where you couldn't go to temple, where you couldn't celebrate your holy days, where you couldn't even in your home worship these gods. And a lot of the temples were destroyed or they were converted into churches. And then from that, you start seeing them become a minority. Then once they become a minority and they don't have any established sense of community, then that's when you start seeing the more individual attacks, like the crimes of witchcraft and such. So instead of just being over your general beliefs, it was against maybe just an act that you did that they didn't agree with. Like during the Crusades, it wasn't for people who weren't Christian. There were many Christians who just didn't think that Jesus literally became bread and wine after it was blessed, and they were persecuted. So it went from being whole religions, to just whoever needed to be controlled, whoever threatened their growth and prosperity as a religion.
Interesting. Thank you. Since it seems like there aren't any other questions in either the YouTube chat or here, we'll probably formally end the event and just open up the floor to anyone. Anyone who wants to speak, and we'll end the kind of formal question format. But right before we end, I'd like to thank Jim for giving an incredibly interesting talk and also answering all our questions. And I'll also plug our various secular society things. Sohan has linked to them in the description, or in the Zoom chat. But also, our website is ssomit.mit.edu, and our next event coming up is on May 7th, where on a similar subject but about the Old Testament, Dr. Josh Bowen will be talking about slavery in the Old Testament. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.